Why are you here? I don't mean that as a large existential question. That's a sermon for later on. But literally, like, why are you here at 700 South Franklin Street in Denver, 80209? Why are you here at St. John's on a beautiful Sunday morning, almost 70 degrees outside, partly cloudy, 0% chance of rain? Why are you here? For some of you, you might say, well, we do this every week. We've been doing this for the past 20 years. Maybe for some of you, you say, this is my church home, or I want to have a relationship with God. Maybe some of you are visiting. You're like, I don't know, I visited you and I found you on Google. Thank you, SEO. Some of you are just, I don't know. Maybe some of you, maybe you came because your spouse made you come. There are a million reasons for you to not be here. And there are a million other people who are outside, going for walks with their dogs, sleeping in, headed to brunch right now, waking up hungover from the Saturday before, currently at work or finishing schoolwork, and yet you are here. You're here. This morning, as we looked at Paul's letter to the Philippians 1:27, what Paul would argue is that there's a much deeper purpose for you being here. And there's so much more than some of the answers that we give. So Paul kicks us off with this in Philippians 1:27. He says this, he says, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit with one mind. Everyone say one mind. Striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. That's Paul's argument, that you're here so that you would strive side by side for the sake of the gospel. And if we're honest this morning, I don't always think about that as the reason why I'm here. I don't always think of this as the church being gathered together, being of one mind. You see, Paul's efforts are great, but sometimes it's really hard to believe that the church would be one together. And don't get me wrong, there's been a lot of great things that the church has done, and I mean the people of God universal. There have been hospitals that have been built and schools that have started, that people have been sent out as missionaries to proclaim the gospel of Jesus, and that's all great. And it's amazing to see what the church has done. And yet, there are a lot of hard things about being part of a church. And maybe you've experienced this too. So just for the sake of being honest, I'm gonna say a statement, and I just want you to raise your hand if this has ever been true for you. I want you to raise your hand if you've ever felt left out of a group before. I put your hands down. Raise your hand if you've been part of a group that has left someone out. Raise your hand if there's been drama in your friend group over this past year. Raise your hand if you've ever walked into a church and felt like you don't belong. I want you to raise your hand if you've ever judged someone before you even had the chance to talk to them. This morning, we're going to talk about 3 realities of the church. We're going to talk about 3 realities of the church and how what Jesus has to say about it and what Paul is encouraging us as we look at these 3 realities. The first one is this, is that the church is diverse, but is also divided. The church is diverse with so many different neighborhoods that are represented even here. People with different political stances, people in different life stages, people with different ethnicities and skin colors or styles or personalities. And that's something that we should celebrate, and that should be a really great thing for us to be a part of and to celebrate what God has done, how he's created us as unique human beings, still made in the image of God. And yet, even as we look around at the diversity, whether it's inside of our church or outside of the church walls, what tends to happen is that there's division that is caused over and over again. And that the church has found itself in a place, specifically even today, that we have succumbed to the world in its division. And I don't just mean theologically, but I mean socially as well. Here's what I mean. There was one time I was walking in New Orleans, and I was on the street, and there was a couple that was standing there, and they were getting their picture drawn. And it was by this artist who was drawing a picture, and I noticed this picture. It was very different than how they actually looked. You see, what this artist was doing is that he was making a caricature. And if you don't know what a caricature is, it's an image of somebody or something where one feature or multiple features are widely exasperated and exaggerated to put focus on that picture. And so I'll give you guys an example. So here's my staff photo. One of them is on the outside of my door. Guess which one? I asked AI to draw me a caricature of both of these photos, and this is what it came up with. I don't look like The Rock, but The Rock looks like me. Notice how in this picture, my smile is over-exaggerated. My eyebrows are, I don't know what they're doing. But this is how we see people. This is how we see people online, when they're walking around, when someone says something. We don't look at people as being made in the image of God, but we look at them as labels. We take one thing and we over-exaggerate it and we name them. The church is diverse, but it's widely divided. Just a couple weeks ago, I was in the parking lot here, and I was talking with somebody. He was smoking a cigarette in his car. And you're not supposed to smoke where there's a school area. And I was talking to him, and he was telling me that he was a Christian. And I asked him, hey, would you stop smoking in here? This is a school. And he proceeded to call me a woke liberal. I mean, he was Christian. He called himself a follower of Jesus, and yet he labeled me. And so we look at people not as made in the image of God, but we look at people as labels. We do this all of the time. And when we look around, we see the diversity of the church, and yet still we divide ourselves up by these labels. The second reality of the church is this, is that the church is together, but it's lonely. Surrounded by people, and yet still feel invisible. In fact, maybe some of you guys here today might be feeling that same way. We are currently, in the United States and all over the world, we are in the largest epidemic of loneliness that the world has ever seen. That statistics showed that 30% of Americans aged 18 to 34 feel lonely every single day. And it's not just us who feel lonely, but the way that we treat people, the way that we see people, is that we don't see people. That we walk right past people as if they are invisible. Because we're so focused on our own priorities and our own schedule and our own calendars. You know, there's a story that Jesus told, and he was talking to somebody that was trying to be really moral and asking who his neighbor is. And Jesus tells this story about a man that's walking down the street and he gets jumped. He gets jumped and beaten up, and they take his wallet, they take his phone, they take his keys, and they run off. And he's left half dead on the side of the road. And a pastor is walking by, and he sees this man on the side of the road, and he's half dead. But the pastor is running late for church, so he goes on the other side of the road and goes off to church. Another man walks by. He's a huge volunteer at his own church. He sees this man who's half dead on the side of the road, but he keeps driving on by because he's late for his life group. And then there comes a man who's smoking weed. And he sees a man that's broken and beat up, bloodied on the side of the road. And he picks him up and he takes him to the hospital. And he pays for his medical bills and making sure that he's taken care of. And the point that Jesus makes is that there are some people that the person that we least expect would show Jesus more than the people who are Christian. The people that we would least expect would show Jesus than the people who are Christian. And the reality is this, is that we find ourselves too busy to be a blessing. You see, Paul is writing his letter from prison. And the reason why he's in prison is that he spent his time preaching the gospel and sharing the gospel with people who desperately needed to hear it. And he got beat up and he got thrown in prison, but I don't think that was on his calendar for the day, was wake up, share the gospel, get arrested. And so if someone after church needed your help, would you have time in your schedule to help them? The church is together but lonely. The third reality of the church is that the church is beautiful but broken. There are moments when church feels amazing, and moments when the church really hurts. There are moments where you have this spiritual mountaintop experience, and a moment where you find yourself in the valley of the shadow of death. There are moments when a song just hits, or a sermon that really speaks to your life, and then you find that the church is getting caught up in a lot of unnecessary things, like what color the carpet is gonna be for our next worship space, or why the chair is blue in here. Or why does AJ sometimes wear glasses when he preaches and sometimes not? It's because of the vibe, that's why. But it's worse than that too. I used to tell this horrible joke to people that working at a church would be so much easier if people weren't involved. And unfortunately, it's true. That the church is filled with a lot of broken people and a lot of brokenness. We're ashamed to admit it. But the church has dealt with a lot of hurt. Scandals and leadership, even things that we've seen here. But it's not just St. John's, it's not just our Highlands campus at Renewal, it's all the churches. It's within our denomination. It's with every other church. And the result of that is that we've had people either leave the church or leave the church. You know, when I was in college, I had this dream of planting a church. I had this idea of how the church should be, and I had so many hopes and so many wishes and so many plans about this church. In fact, the last church I was at when I was in Austin working at a church there, my hope was that eventually I would go and plant another church. But leading up to that point, I had seen a lot of brokenness in the church. You tend to do that after working at a church for 10 years. Seen people literally taking advantage of the church through their leadership, through stealing, through scandals, through people in positions of power who shouldn't be there. through lies, deception, you name it. And the more that I dreamed about planting a church, the more I realized that every time I envisioned a church that I'd want to start, I realized it was a church that had never been created. And what I realized is I was trying to create the perfect model of the church in my own eyes. And what happened is over the years, it started developing into an anger that started turning into an ego. I'd seen all that the church had. I'm not going to be like that, or I can change the church, or I can do it myself. But the reality is that all I was trying to do was try to plant a church in my own ego rather than planting a church in the image of what Jesus has envisioned for his church. And the reality is, I wasn't trying to serve the church, I was trying to control it. And what I realized is that I'm part of the brokenness of the church too. And every now and again, after preaching and getting the affirmations and the, oh, you should be a pastor comment, there's still this little voice in my head that says, you can do this on your own. And that's not what the church is meant for. That's not what Jesus intended for his bride. In fact, there's a really cool thing that happens in the Bible with Jesus. You see, Jesus is praying. He's praying in this long prayer that's known as the high priestly prayer in John 17. And it's right before he goes to the cross and right before he's executed to die for you and for me. And he's praying for his disciples. He's praying for the people that he's walking with continuously for the past 3 years. People that would eventually abandon him and leave him for dead. People that would eventually deny ever knowing him. And Jesus in this high priestly prayer where he takes on the image together, all of the prayers of the people of God together and offering it to God. Jesus says these words in John 17, 20-21. He says this, I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be, everyone say it with me, one. Just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they may also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. Jesus is praying for these disciples that are eventually going to scatter. And not only that, he says this, he says that I'm praying for those who will believe in me through their word. The ones that left him for dead, the ones that denied ever knowing him, would eventually come back and see the resurrection of Jesus in the flesh and would continue to tell that story over and over again, eventually to Paul, eventually to Timothy, eventually to the church in Ephesus, eventually to the church in Philippi. And for the next 2,000 years, we would see this gospel message continue to be carried over until May 3rd, 2026, where it's been brought to you. And what Jesus is saying is, I'm not only praying for the disciples who are here with me right now, but every single disciple that would come after them, which means that Jesus is praying for you. Jesus is praying for you. If there's any place for you to find yourself in the scriptures, it is right here where Jesus prays for you to be one. And the reality is this, is that Jesus is praying because he believed in the church. And Jesus still believes in the church today. Even after 2,000 years of division and loneliness and brokenness, he is entrusting his message to go forth through us together. And Jesus entrusted Paul with that same message. And Paul, what he's doing here to the church in Philippi is he's begging for them to strive side by side. He says, so if there's any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. If there's anything that we are called to do that's worthy of the gospel of Christ, that we would strive side by side as the church united. Because there are people out there, and people within our own homes, and people that we love and care about, that have really great intentions that are leading them to hell. And Jesus cares about the church so much because he cares about the people who need to hear the gospel of Jesus, who need to hear about the hope and the love of God. And Paul is begging his church, if you have any emotion, if you know that you've been baptized into Christ, if you are a part of his church, then be the church, side by side. And when Paul is saying to have one mind, he says, I want the church to be united. And unity is not the same as sameness. But unity is that we walk together towards the same direction for the gospel of Jesus. No matter how diverse we are, no matter how polarized our society is, no matter how many times we look at other people and label them, we walk side by side together. And this is how Paul says we are to do it. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Notice how Paul's definition of being of one mind isn't actually to do more, but it's actually to do less. Because unity requires sacrifice. Unity requires sacrifice to let down your own ego, to let down your own self-interest. So what does that look like for us? It's that Jesus would interrupt your life because Jesus interrupted his life for us. We didn't read it this morning, but I want to read it for us because the verse continues to keep going in verse 5 through 7. He says, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. That Jesus himself left his heavenly throne room, cleared his calendar, came down to earth to be born of a baby, to take on human flesh, to sit among people who are broken, just like you and just like me. That he would take his time to walk and sit and speak with people and heal people. And when Jesus was doing his ministry, he was never in a rush. So much so that he allowed people to touch the robe of his hem, the hem of his robe, so that he would be healed. That Jesus would sit and have lunch with thousands of people. That Jesus would stop at people's homes and talk with them. And when people had questions, he would listen. Jesus spent 3 years doing ministry at the slowest pace that I've ever seen someone work. And he was effective. 2,000 years later, he's still effective. And so, my challenge for you is let Jesus interrupt your life this week. If we are called to put down our own self-interests, our own egos, our own conceit, then we need to adopt the mind of Jesus. That our interests need to be Jesus' own interests. That's what it means to have unity as the church. That's what it means to be of one mind together. And this is what Jesus does with the realities of the church. Once we were a divided church, but through Jesus, we have become united in him. And so this week, let Christ interrupt your assumptions. That person that you labeled, that person that you made unfair judgments, think about that person. What would it be like to simply get to know them more than the labels that you've put on them? Because you cannot have one mind with someone that you've already made your mind up about. And you might find that when you seek to have unity with someone, you may have more in common with them than you even realize. The second is this, is that once we were a lonely people, and Jesus has moved us through his life to make us known and to make others known too. So let Jesus interrupt your calendar this week. Who needs your blessing rather than your busyness this week? And what if someone needed your help this week? Would your schedule have time to allow you to help them? And maybe your prayer for this week is, Lord, interrupt my calendar to make room for you. The last one is this, is that once we were a broken people, and Jesus has made us beautiful. So let Jesus interrupt your interests. What keeps you from striving side by side with the church for the sake of the gospel? Maybe you're here and you have some reservations about the church. Maybe you've amened my entire first half of the message. I want to challenge you to let go of your interests of walking away from the church. That the church would fight for community with each other, no matter how broken it is. And Jesus himself, when he was betrayed by his own friends, still believed in the church and still believes in the church today. And maybe it's your own ego. Maybe it's your own personal preferences that need to be laid down. Maybe you don't fully understand, but you want to lean in and see what God is really doing with his church. And maybe it's taking those interests, and maybe just one interest, that's fulfilling your self-interest, your own ego, to make yourself feel better, and maybe it's just taking it and releasing it to God. And imagine what the church looks like when we're united in the same direction together. Healing becomes possible. Not just within the church, but outside the church. We start to believe in the church, just as Jesus believes in the church. And maybe, just maybe, that's something that's worth showing up here at 700 South Franklin Street. It's worth showing up. Amen.